All right, thank you everybody for tuning in via Zoom and for our audience members here live at the Lewis Public Library. Good evening, my name is Mike Brickner. I am the Executive Director of the ACLU of Delaware. I use he, him pronouns, and I am so excited to be here. One, because I love public libraries and particularly the Lewis Public Library. They are such great hosts. We're here with Rebecca Lowe, who has been our main contact here, and she's a little bit of a celebrity in ACLU circles and I think in Sussex County circles. She's actually our 2022 Candler awardee that we're going to be recognizing in October of this year for all of her work here in Sussex County. So thank you, Rebecca, for that. But I am also extremely excited and proud to be here with some great Delaware and national ACLU colleagues to talk about a very urgent issue. And that is the issue of the eviction crisis and the need for a right to representation for people who are experiencing evictions. Many of us have heard, especially since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, about the eviction crisis, but evictions have been an issue in our communities for decades and decades and decades, but it was really accentuated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And so many states and municipalities have started to move towards guaranteeing a right to representation for renters who are experiencing eviction. So tonight, we're going to hear from some state and national experts about why this is such an important issue. We're going to hear why it's an issue, especially here in Delaware. We're going to hear about advocacy here in the state of Delaware and what's next for that. And so without further ado, I'm going to just briefly introduce our three speakers, and they're going to start off with a couple of words, but then we're going to have, I'm going to ask them a few questions, but then we're going to open it up for any questions from folks here in the audience, but also for those of you who are tuning in via Zoom, you can chat in your questions for the panelists. Rebecca will write them down for us and we will ask the panelists. So tonight on the panel, we have Ian Thompson, who is a senior legislative counsel with the, I got that mostly right, with the ACLU in Washington, D.C. We have Javon Rich, who is our policy and advocacy director at the ACLU of Delaware. And then we have Sandra Park, who is the senior staff attorney with the ACLU's Women's Rights Project. So let's go ahead and start with Sandra. I'm going to go to your end of the table and just give us a few of your initial thoughts.
Sure. Well, it's such a pleasure to be here today. Thank you all for joining us in person and over Zoom to talk about this issue, which is very near and dear to my heart and has been central to my work for many years. Okay. All right. Hopefully this is a bit better. No? Is it not working? Oh, okay. Sorry, maybe I'll hold it then. All right, how's this? Okay, great. So I've been with the Women's Rights Project at the National ACLU for the last 15 years, and housing justice has been one of my main priorities. I think a lot of times when folks think about women's rights, housing justice might not come to the fore, but what we have seen over many decades, and certainly what motivates a lot of my work now, is that there's so many barriers to fair housing for women and their families, particularly Black women and women of color. And that has severe consequences in terms of what our communities look like, what opportunities are available for folks, for their families, for their possibilities of jobs, healthcare, childcare, and in so many realms of life. So for that reason, housing has really been an important piece of my work, and particularly thinking about evictions and addressing the unfair impact of evictions, the unfair eviction processes that we have in place that have been really accepted in so many communities. And that right to representation will really go a long way in helping to address.
And Javon, you want to share a few of your opening thoughts?
Again, my name is Javon Rich, and I've been involved in the right to representation work for about the last year and a half. So I would say Sandra has a lot more experience in this realm than I. And I'm also a social worker. So a lot of what I know about housing has been on that end. So, when I used to work in child welfare, there were times when we had children in state custody simply because their parents were unable to afford housing or were evicted, right? So there wasn't any physical abuse, it was just housing. And I would think, why can't we just get them housing, help stabilize this family so that their kids could be home with them, right? And also including working with survivors of domestic violence. But in the last year or so, a lot of the work that I will be talking about specifically is based on coalition work. So I would be remiss to not mention the Right to Representation Coalition, which consisted of ACLU National, ACLU of Delaware, Housing Alliance Delaware, Metropolitan Wilmington Urban League's Homes Campaign, Community Legal Aid Society, Inc., Delaware Volunteer Legal Services, Delaware Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and organizations. If I missed anybody, just know that I love you, because we had a long list of people. But it kind of showed you, how housing intersects with so many, different aspects, like thinking about how right to representation can help people who are survivors of domestic violence. So it was really great to have, like the Delaware Coalition Against Domestic Violence in this work. So in our coalition, we met frequently and talked about how do we make this a reality in our state, from strategic planning to educating people on right to representation, but also educating state leaders about, the benefits of this program for Delaware.
And Ian, how about for you?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's a real pleasure to be with all of you this evening. My name is Ian Thompson. I am a senior legislative advocate in the ACLU's National Political Advocacy Department. I've been with the ACLU for going on 17 years. But in terms of this work around housing justice and right to representation, this is work that the national organization has really been involved with, I would say, since the early days of the COVID pandemic. Specifically recently. Sandra can certainly talk about some of the historic work that the ACLU has done over many decades on this issue, including a significant report from the 1980s. Actually, it's kind of how far back our work in this space goes. But it was in those early days of the COVID pandemic, we're talking March, April, May of 2020, that the national organization recognized that we were really facing a mass eviction crisis, because people were losing their jobs by the tens of thousands and had no ability to pay their rent. And while stopgap measures like eviction moratoriums were essential in literally keeping roofs over people's heads, we knew that that was essentially just kicking the can down the road about this mass eviction crisis, and that we needed to be pursuing real kind of well thought out long-term policy solutions. And for us as an organization, this work around legal representation for those facing eviction is a really natural fit for the ACLU. We've been deeply involved in pushing for legal representation in civil context for decades. Probably the most prominent example is in the immigration space, right? That is also an area where right to legal representation is not guaranteed, but where we as the ACLU have said it's really essential for ensuring due process and other constitutional protections. And likewise, in this space, evictions, as Sandra can certainly speak to, are an incredibly complex legal process, not to mention just devastating and terrifying for those on the receiving end of them. And for people to understand their fundamental rights, you really can't navigate this process without the benefit of a lawyer. So for both the kind of due process aspects of this, it's really important. But as we can speak to, in jurisdiction after jurisdiction that has adopted legal representation for those facing eviction, it has just been proven time and time again to be a highly effective strategy in preventing evictions by literally keeping people in their homes. So that's my primary interest in pursuing this, and why I feel so strongly about the work that we have been doing over the past several years here in Delaware to get it at the statewide level, and are committed to continuing to do that work.
Great. So I'm going to ask some questions individually of each of the panelists, but Sandra, I'm going to start with you again. But we've kind of talked a little bit about the, eviction crisis and COVID-19, but tell me a little bit, going out on the national front, why is right to representation so important in terms of preventing evictions, and why is it so important right now?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important in part because of what we've seen with the pandemic. I think some of the emergency measures that came out at the federal, state, and local levels were successful in stopping some evictions during the pandemic, but now we see a lot of those protections lifted. The emergency rental assistance funds are drying up, and rents are skyrocketing. We see that rents are a main driver of inflation in our economy across the nation. And so housing insecurity is at record high levels right now. We see that borne out in the census survey data, where an incredibly high percentage of households are reporting that they cannot make the rent next month. And so right now, right to representation is one of the evidence-based responses to actually stopping evictions and improving the outcomes of those cases for families. It means people might be able to stay in their homes. It means that they are actually able to assert legal protections that legislators have put in place. But the law doesn't mean anything unless a tenant actually has a lawyer to advocate on their behalf and assert those rights. And that's one of the main important outcomes that comes with representation. It also means that, things like unfair fines and fees that get piled up onto eviction judgments are often avoided through representation, and that the record of the eviction, which we have seen for so many families, in essence, blacklist you from future housing opportunities. An attorney can help with that, can help figure out if that record can be mitigated in some way so that it won't bar you from being able to apply to new housing in the future. So there's so many possible positive ramifications from having representation. And in this current context where eviction risk is so high, it's incredibly important.
So Sandra said a whole lot of really important things, but one that I keyed into was the phrase evidence-based to talk about right to representation. So to me, that means that it's something that we know works, that it doesn't just feel good to do that reform, but we actually have data to show that it's effective. And to have that data, I assume other cities and states have actually implemented this and tested it out. So Ian, maybe that's a good question for you. What are other places across the country doing in this regards right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So my first work in this space actually was in the fall of 2020 when I became aware of a ballot measure in Boulder, Colorado, to establish a universal right to counsel for any renter facing eviction in the city of Boulder for any reason. This was, I thought, a really important potential policy to put in place. And so the ACLU National, working with our Colorado affiliate, and the on-the-ground campaign there, which was called No Eviction Without Representation Boulder, we provided some investments and supports to them in the kind of home stretch of that campaign, and they ended up winning by about a 20-point margin. And then from there, after that win, really just several weeks later, we worked with Baltimore Renters United on an effort to get right to representation adopted in Baltimore City. And that was yet another win. And this is all, kind of coming out of that understanding, I think, that COVID brought to the surface about how vulnerable many people are to eviction. And then really what we've seen since then is very significant momentum behind this push. 3 states so far have adopted right to representation at the statewide level: Washington State, Maryland, and Connecticut. And then we've seen numerous other jurisdictions advance right to representation over the past 2 to 3 years, including just this past year. We've seen right to representation adopted in Detroit. New Orleans was the first jurisdiction in the Deep South to adopt right to representation, and a number of others as well. And they're really building off of successes that came before in places like Philadelphia and San Francisco and New York City and Cleveland and others. And we really want to establish this protection for renters right here in Delaware. And certainly Javon or Mike could speak to this, but one of the reasons that we feel so strongly that Delaware is a state that really needs these protections is because of the significantly higher rates of evictions and who they impact in this state. And so we're definitely very committed to continuing in this fight, and hopefully all of the strong momentum we've seen at both a statewide level and at a city level in jurisdictions from east to west, north to south, will serve as momentum for continuing to push this in the General Assembly here in Delaware.
Such an important thing, Ian, and yeah, we've kind of zoned out to the national picture, but I do want to go straight to Delaware. And I did coffee meetings all the last 2 days down here in Sussex County, and every single coffee meeting I went to, somebody mentioned housing as an issue down here. So Javon, maybe you can talk a little bit about why is this such a big issue, a big problem in Delaware today?
Yeah, so the numbers will show, how big of a problem it is in Delaware, like Ian said. We talk a lot about the COVID crisis and its impact on housing, but eviction filing rates was already increasing before the pandemic. So between 2019 and 2020, eviction filing rates had increased by 26%. Okay?
Here in Delaware.
Here in Delaware. The brain moment right now.
That's all right. I'm getting a lot more of them as I get older. I'm having my senior moments. So eviction filings were going up. What did we see then when the pandemic hit? Did we see like there being a pause, and did they restart?
So there was a pause because of the eviction moratorium, but then it restarted, and evictions, continued, the way that they were. Annually, we saw that 18,000 evictions were filed. So on an average, 18,000 eviction filings right here in Delaware, okay? And so that's, 16% of the housing, the housing inventory, essentially, 16%. And that is significantly higher than the national rate. So nationally, we're sitting at a 2% eviction filing rate. And when you think about comparing Delaware to states of a similar size, like Connecticut and Rhode Island, those two states have an eviction filing rate of 4%. So our small state, small wonder, has an eviction filing rate that is 4 times that of, states of comparable size. And also, when you think about when it comes to racial disparities and what that looks like, here in Delaware, zip codes that have a higher population of people of color have higher rates of eviction filing, so that they coincide together. So Delaware has an eviction filing problem that is worse than the national average, worse than states that are of similar size. And on top of that, when you think about, just the size of our state, we should be able to get something like this done, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a state under 1 million people, and we had 18,000 eviction filings. I mean, that is really, I mean, astronomical when you think, and of course, not all of those 1 million people in the state rent. Many of us own homes, right? And I'm glad you mentioned the zip code issue, and where we see more people of color, we see higher rates of evictions. Because I want to go back to Sandra, because she's really studied this issue for a long time. But talk to me a little bit about who's most impacted by evictions, and what are some of the ways that a person's life might be impacted by eviction or housing insecurity or homelessness?
Yeah. So yeah, there's been an incredible amount of data that's come out over the last few years on evictions. A lot of it driven by the Eviction Lab, which is based in Princeton and is directed by Matthew Desmond. So for folks who are interested, and I'm sure there's a copy of the book right here in the library. He wrote a book called Evicted several years ago, which I think really shone a light in terms of the eviction crisis. But what we know for sure is evictions disproportionately harm communities of color, particularly Black and Latinx families, and particularly Black women and Latino women and their families. Another really significant fact that I think a lot of people are unaware of is that having a child in the family seems to be very strongly correlated with being at risk for eviction. There's a statistic that nearly 1 in 5 Black and Latinx children have experienced eviction by the age of 15. So, to me, that's incredibly alarming to think about a generation of young people who have gone through the disruptive displacement of what eviction means, which means, you're suddenly being uprooted from your home, your community. You may face having to switch schools, childcare, all of those other factors that are connected to where you live. When just all the small things about your possessions, whether or not you're going to be able to take the basic comforts that you live with every day with you, whether you'll lose those, whether they'll make it with you to wherever you live next. And so that's there's a lot that happens at the individual level, and then there's been a lot of research done on sort of the longer term impacts. And some of this information for folks who are interested is collected in a research brief that we published in May with the National Coalition for the Civil Right to Counsel in partnership with our research department at the ACLU. That research brief is called No Eviction Without Representation, and it's available on our website. But it really looks at a lot of the documented studies on the harms of eviction. So those harms include long-term health impacts, both physical and mental health impacts that result when folks experience eviction. There are a lot of very practical barriers that arise in terms of just your access to your prescriptions, whether or not you're able to carry your insurance to new healthcare providers. There's also research on the impact on voting. And I think that's an issue that people don't think about a lot, that when somebody is evicted from their home, are they going to be able to vote in the next election? Are they going to be able to be registered in the right place? Are they going to be recognized as someone who's allowed to vote in that neighborhood? And then certainly there's a lot of research on the impact on children and their educational outcomes that we are very alarmed about as well. One other thing I want to mention, which, I find, I think as maybe an ACLU lawyer, very disturbing also about eviction, is that when people are threatened with eviction, especially if they don't have representation, if they have a legal basis to defend that eviction, they often choose not to, because it's worse for them to end up on a list of being someone who has faced eviction than actually going into court and possibly winning their case. And I've worked with many tenants over the years who went to court, defended against eviction, won because they had meritorious legal arguments, but then faced, a blacklist for the rest of, for many years after that, that they could not rent elsewhere, even though they had won their case. And so without representation, you're much more likely to have to deal with that issue and decide to give up your legal rights because the blacklist will follow you and your family around for years.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like such a kind of sick cycle, right? So you get targeted with eviction, and even if you're successful and you challenge it in court, that you could still end up on this blacklist. But also, if you are successfully evicted, that continues to follow you around, correct?
Yes, definitely. And I mean, I think, as a society, we need to think more about, why are we punishing folks for maybe at a particular period of their life, having some sort of economic hardship, maybe a job loss or some other circumstance. And, that type of punishment that will bar you from future housing just has so many ramifications for families and communities. So yeah, that's definitely something we are also working to address.
Yeah, it's hard to have a job. It's hard to get your kids to school. It's hard to take care of your health if you don't have housing, right? So, so I'm sold on the need to right to representation, but admittedly, I'm kind of an easy sell. But I mean, it seems to me like it's such a common sense issue, right? That here in the United States, we value due process and the Constitution. And, we for, centuries have, said people need to have a right to representation in criminal cases, and we've expanded that in other civil cases. So who's opposing right to representation in evictions, Ian, and why?
Yeah, of course. So actually, before I jump into that question, Mike, I just wanted to follow up on something that that Sandra was laying out at the conclusion of her remarks. I think she laid out a very powerful case for why we need a right to representation. Another one, if you're just looking at this from the kind of cold hard numbers of it, is study after study has consistently shown essentially that for every dollar a jurisdiction invests in providing representation to renters facing eviction, you end up getting something like a 3-to-1 investment back in terms of money that you're not then expending on essentially like social safety nets for those who are experiencing homelessness. So there is a very strong legal case, a moral case, an ethical case that can be made to providing representation for renters facing eviction. There's also just a kind of cold hard numbers case that, this is just a smart way for a jurisdiction to expend resources on the front end that you get in savings on the back end. And then in terms of, who is fighting this, well, it probably won't surprise people to know that landlords who have a significant advantage in terms of eviction proceedings, because they are significantly more likely to be represented. I believe here in Delaware, it's well over 80% of landlords go into eviction proceedings with legal representation. And it would not surprise people, of course, to know that if you can't afford to pay your rent, which is why probably a significant majority of renters are facing eviction, then you certainly don't have money to lay out for legal representation in an eviction proceeding. And that's why here in Delaware, there's only 2% of renters who are facing eviction who have legal representation. So we have well over 80% of landlords who are represented and 2% of renters who are represented. And landlords and large property companies, developers are very reluctant to give up a significant legal advantage that they have in terms of making it very easy to just, hey, you're out of here, and have the eviction granted within, a certain amount of time. And there's very little standing in the way of that. For all of the reasons that we laid out, we don't think that is a fair system. What we are pushing for is really just a sense of fairness in these proceedings, so that the deck which is already so heavily stacked against renters, at least they have a fighting chance of understanding what their legal rights are. And I think that's a really important principle. And one final thing I'll say on this is that it is often depicted when you say landlords, like we're talking about mom and pop landlords who might be renting out a room in the house and to let one family, and certainly that can constitute somebody who is a landlord. but oftentimes we're talking about very large property companies, very large companies that, you know, exercise significant political influence, which we can also maybe dive into at some point, Mike, that, you know, also, of course, are the real drivers, I would say, of mass eviction. Mass eviction is not being driven primarily by mom and pop landlords. It's being driven by very large property companies.
Right. Mom and pop did not file 18,000 evictions here in the state of Delaware, right? Oftentimes that's coming from large rental companies. So, you know, so speaking of the political landscape and everything, I'm going to turn it back over to Javon here in a second. But, you know, she kind of previewed for you all earlier that, you know, there was and still is a big effort to get right to representation here in the state. And we were really trying to pass Senate Bill 101, which was the right to representation bill here. Unfortunately, at the end of session on June 30th, it didn't pass. We've heard how this will benefit everybody. It's a great law and everything. So, Javon, what the heck happened? Why didn't it pass?
Oh, this is giving me a little bit of trauma of June 30th, but we got really close, you know, we got really close. So what we refer to as Senate Bill 101 passed the Senate in 2021. And so going into the 2022 legislative year, it was in the House, right? And by the time it was in the House, it had been amended like a lot, okay? Like by the time this bill reached June 30th, I think we were asking for the bare minimum and we weren't even getting that. So on June 30th, how the bill was sitting. So I'm going to tell you what was in there originally that was taken out, right? So the powers that be eliminated the right to eliminated the minimum amount of back pay that one must have before an eviction. So what we've seen people get evicted for $20 in back pay, right? $20, $100. But this new amendment, back rent, thank you, back rent. So this new amendment, you know, removed that protection for that minimum back rent. It also eliminated the, you know, if the tenant or renter did pay their back rent, it would, you know, the eviction filing would be dropped. Nope, they could pay the back rent and the landlord could still choose to evict them. It eliminated a pre-filing eviction diversion program. And so even if you have an eviction filed against you, if you win, just having that filing on your record is going to impact your ability to get housing. So this amendment removed the pre-filing diversion program. So we were, you know, June 30th, you know, we're like, at least we'll still get something. At least we'll still get something. So on June 30th, this right to representation bill would have provided representation, and the representation could have been legal. It could have been an advocate who's, you know, well-versed in housing, you know, laws. It would have provided that, you know, representation for people who were 200% under the federal poverty guidelines, okay? 200% under the poverty guidelines, right? So that, I don't even know, like, how do you say no to that? You know, how do you even say no to that, right? So it also, you know, placed the right to representation program in the Delaware Attorney General's office. So the Delaware Attorney General's office would have partnered with legal services and community organizations to be able to provide that representation for people. And then it created a post-filing eviction diversion program. So there were a lot of concessions and we were still, you know, wanting that representation for people. So the bill did not pass the House on a 16-23, so 16 no's, 23 yeses. And I'm sorry, 16 yeses and 23 no's, so it failed the House. And, you know, again, like Ian said, it was, you know, legislators who may have been more influenced by the power of the lobby of realtor organizations or landlord organizations, even if their community or their constituents, were polled and they knew that their constituents would have benefited from a program like this. So this was definitely an experience for me to see how much influence money can play into when you think about who landlord organizations are donating their money to, and how that definitely makes a difference in the legislators' vote. But it's not the end all be all, right? Because we can still show up in numbers. And the fact that we got so far on this definitely shows something. The fact, and it was a hard fight. It wasn't just the ACLU and ACLU of Delaware. There's a lot of other organizations that work very closely with people who are experiencing homelessness, experiencing homelessness when they have a legal right to remain in their homes. So.
And, just so folks know, I mean, in those 23 no votes, so my understanding is every Republican voted against it essentially, and then there were 8 or so Democrats who voted against it as well. Now, some of those Democrats too were people that have like really high numbers of renters in their districts too. So why would they vote against their own constituents' interests like that? Any thoughts?
I'm not going to accuse anybody of anything, but money is a big deal, right? Money is a big deal. And, even though, when we think about the renters, we also got to think sometimes legislators don't think about their constituency. They think about their constituency that votes, right? So that's another thing to think about. But, who they're hearing from the most, thinking about whether or not they have someone who's going to, run against them can, be a really big factor in, what kind of decisions that they make. But yeah, we're gonna have to talk. Those people have to speak for themselves. I can't really tell you why.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Can I say on this? So as somebody who's been doing legislative advocacy for the ACLU for going on, I guess in a few years, will be 20 years. I certainly believe that political leaders can grow and change for the better. I mean, I wouldn't be doing this work if I didn't believe that on some level. But I also believe that growth doesn't happen in a vacuum. I believe in accountability when members are doing things that are harmful to people from the perspective of an organization that cares about civil rights and civil liberties. And I think that we have to say that we had tremendous champions of this legislation in the General Assembly, particularly in Senator Brian Townsend, who's the majority leader in the Senate. Thank you,
Hello, Senator Townsend. Thank you.
Townsend, I did not know that you were on before I said that.
I love you all.
We couldn't have asked for a stronger champion in the Senate, and then in the House with Representative Mimi Minor Brown, who really took this on and championed it. Very grateful for that. But then we had, in addition to, as Mike said, a solid block of opposition from Republicans in the House, Speaker Pete Schwarzkopf, who were, down here in his district now, he was one of those no votes. Representative Stephanie Bolden from the 2nd District in Wilmington, she was a no vote. This despite the fact that she represents the district hardest hit by evictions in the state of Delaware. So you have to ask yourself, if this is somebody who is truly fighting for the interest of their constituents, would you vote against a bill that would benefit your constituents more than any others in the state? So whose interest is she protecting, in casting that no vote? And so I do think accountability is important. And I think it's important that people know where their legislators stand on these issues. And hopefully, we'll have a different political outcome in the next session. But one thing is very clear to me. We are not going to get this legislation over the finish line because of the good-natured attitudes and spirits of our elected leaders. It's going to happen because people in the state of Delaware are demanding it. And one thing that I can speak to from lessons that I've learned in working on these efforts in jurisdictions around the country is that those who are most impacted by evictions have to be at the forefront of leading this work forward. And in example after example, I can point to of these are the successful efforts are always led by renters themselves, with support from organizations like the ACLU and many others. But you know, we really need people to be demanding this of their elected officials and making clear, because you know, primary election day is about a month out now, that when you go to the polls, that you're going to be keeping issues like right to representation at the forefront of your mind in deciding who you cast your vote for.
Well, and I'm gonna take my prerogative as moderator to give a shameless plug, because here in Delaware, we have actually hired a campaign manager around our ACLU voter campaign. We have a great website called votedelaware.org, where we are profiling some of the key civil liberties issues here in Delaware. And so we're asking candidates, because we're electing an entirely new House and an entirely new state Senate, we're asking every candidate to give their positions on those things. And so again, right to representation, education equity, voting rights, immigrants' rights, smart justice, reproductive freedom, all on the ballot in this election coming up here very soon. And so again, we want to make sure to elevate those issues. So this next question is for anybody who wants to jump in, but you know, what's next for right to representation here in Delaware? You know, we had the bill that failed, but I assume we're going to be pushing ahead. And how can folks get involved in that effort?
Well, of course, to get involved, you know, Ian talked about and Mike talked about our upcoming election. So even finding out who is on your ballot and asking them, would you support, you know, some people talk about issues. Do you believe in this? I say, no. Would you support a bill like this? Would you support this bill?
Be specific, right? Yeah.
Be very specific, and, you know, take that with you and keep that in your mind, you know, make that one of your top issues when it comes to voting. Or even, you know, talking, some legislators don't have challengers. So even talking with your legislators now about it, you know, if you don't have, you know, a candidate who has a challenger, so to speak. Other ways that you can get involved, including, and I also talk about, you know, Ian's talked about different jurisdictions, right? So this has been implemented in jurisdictions and not statewide somewhere, you know, we gotta get it where we can get it. So speaking with your county and town about how can you make this a reality for people in your town and your county. And then the third way to get involved, you know, follow the ACLU of Delaware. Darn it, Morgan, we probably have a tag somewhere. I'm a terrible communications advocate.
I'm going to help folks because I'm mic'd and Morgan's not. But here's what you can do is go to the ACLU of Delaware website, and all of our social media is linked there, so you can get to it there. But also, this is another, I'll take another prerogative and do a shameless plug, but also, you know, sign up for email alerts. You'll be able to get all of the action alerts, all of the inside information about the legislature. And also, if you're not an ACLU member, remember all of your membership dollars actually go to our legislative lobbying work and our electoral work. And so again, that's really, really important in terms of making sure that we can continue to do this work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, I don't know how many people are online, but there are people here in this room, and it's remarkable on a Thursday right before like beach weekend, like getting this information. Talk with people that you know about this, because it's a lot of people don't know about this issue or don't think about this issue in regards to, you know, that there are solutions out there that our state leaders are not considering thoughtfully.
So, you know, I want to zoom out one more time before we get to maybe questions from our audience. But, you know, we've talked a lot about right to representation, but many of you have worked in the housing space for a long time. And I imagine that right to representation is but one piece of the puzzle for real housing justice. So, of course, we're going to push for right to representation, but if we're thinking about other things that are going to help people who are experiencing housing insecurity, evictions, homelessness, what are other things that places are doing to help improve those people's lives?
I can start and then maybe others can join. I mean, there's so much activity actually happening. I would say nationally, housing justice, I think it's a oh.
I can have your attention, please. The library will be closed.
Great. Yeah, I mean, nationally, there's a lot of energy behind various housing justice initiatives. Also, because we really are we are in a crisis right now in so many communities. So, there's work happening federally to expand funding for various housing initiatives, including the development of more housing for low and lower income folks in different communities. There's a lot of work happening to look at eviction processes beyond right to representation to make them more fair, including measures like pre-filing diversion, which here in Delaware was part of the legislation on right to representation. In other places is being pursued separately because folks know that if we can have people, tenants and landlords talk and try to work out the issue before filing an eviction, that so many times that works out for folks, and that an eviction can be entirely avoided with pre-filing diversion programs. There's a lot happening on looking at various forms of discrimination that people experience when they seek housing, whether we're talking about people who might have prior criminal records, including very old criminal records, people who are seeking housing with some sort of subsidy, like a Section 8 voucher, who have routinely faced discrimination and denial just based on the fact that they're trying to pay their rent in part with a voucher. And there's a lot of other work happening as well on the issue of sexual harassment in housing and other forms of gender-based violence that relates to housing. One thing we did see with the pandemic, and particularly with vulnerability of renters, is that there seems to be reported increases in sexual harassment that tenants are facing from housing managers or landlords because they don't have power in that dynamic, and they are often vulnerable to that type of abuse. So anyways, there's a lot of different types of work happening, I would say both federally and then also at the state and local levels. Really trying to get at both expanding what housing is available, and then also addressing, the fair housing issues that people are experiencing when they are in housing.
The only other thing that I would add is I think it's a really important issue, and it's certainly something that Sandra has a lot of experience working on, and that is the importance of sealing of eviction records. Really speaks to a lot of the follow-on harm and discrimination that renters can face who have experienced eviction. Right? It's like in some cases it can be essentially like a lifelong blacklist. So that's really essential to making sure that people are able to obtain housing after experiencing an eviction. I really think of the eviction work as like three legs of a stool. On the front end, it's very important to have the pre-filing diversion programs that make it so that people don't end up in eviction proceedings. The second leg is once you are in an eviction proceeding, you certainly should not have to experience that on your own. And that's where the right to representation comes into play. And then the final leg of that stool is if you do experience eviction, if you are evicted and you have that record, providing for sealing of eviction records is essential to making sure that people are able to obtain future housing. So just in the eviction space, I think those are three essential protections that lawmakers at all levels of government should be pursuing.
So we need the full stool. Right now, we don't even have a seat. So we got to start building now. Well, I'm going to go to the audience questions because I love a group that is not shy and they have asked several questions. So this gets back to the data around Delaware's eviction rates and the fact that it's 4 times higher than the national average. So why were eviction rates going up in Delaware compared with other states? What explains that?
I'm not sure of the reason for the increase between 2019 and 2020, but one reason why our rates is exceptionally high is because we have a low cost for filing an eviction. So it only costs landlords, well, not only because it could be a lot of money. It costs landlords $45 to file an eviction against a renter. Some states like Vermont, it costs $295. So what we're seeing is landlords filing evictions simply for the purpose of collecting rent. Like they're using this as a way to encourage someone to pay their rent. And then, once they get their rent, they might drop the eviction rate. So that's why we have that high eviction rate, because of the low cost for landlords to file evictions.
And Sandra, I think you talked earlier about the eviction lab at Princeton has a lot of this data. Do they only look at the state level, or do they actually break it down by county and city? What can we see there?
Yeah, they have a lot of information by county. One issue is that it's not that easy to get a lot of eviction data from some court systems. So they collect what they can, and they really have tried to create the first national repository for this type of information. There's also efforts actually at the federal level to think about legislative approaches so that we can more systematically collect eviction data and understand it, including along racial and gender demographics. But Eviction Lab has a lot of data at the county level. It just depends on whether that county has their records available. So, yeah.
I asked that because another question was asking about numbers specifically here in Sussex County. And, my also theory around why Delaware's numbers are so high is partly driven by what I think the changes we're seeing here in Sussex County, that this is the place where we've had the most growth, but also there's a real lack of affordable housing. Tenants are struggling quite a bit. And we're also seeing a growth in the immigrant population, which is, Sandra talked about earlier, a group that could be highly susceptible to being sort of preyed upon in these types of situations. So, again, as I said, over the last 2 days, every coffee meeting I've had here in Sussex County, somebody has mentioned the housing crisis here. So I think that could be another interesting driver too. Another question. One person wants to know, why has Delaware been so overly protective of landlords and their interests? Javon, you get all the hard political questions.
No, I got the
Go ahead,
hard political questions. So what I will say is it could, simply that money talks, right? Sometimes when they're working with landlords and developers, they're businesses. They're businesses who are saying, we're bringing homes to your town, we're bringing housing to your city or town, and without, legislators appeasing landlords, they could be threatening to saying, oh, well, we're not going to rent anymore, and, affect the housing supply. So that has been something that had come up in meetings. Well, if you implement right to representation, no one's going to want to rent their home to someone in this state, and you're going to find yourself having an issue with the housing supply, which is something that state leaders don't want to hear right now, right? Especially the fact that that rent is high and that the supply is low and that we don't have a robust inventory of low income housing.
So I'm told there's a question here in the audience that somebody can ask. So we're going to go ahead right here, and then I see one up here as well.
I have two questions. One is the 18,000 eviction notices, whatever you call it. What's the time period that was done in?
So that is an average of annually. So it was before 2020. I don't know what the time frame was, but around 2020, that was the annual rate.
And my second question is, I volunteer on the State Council for Persons with Disabilities. You mentioned communities that are, or populations that are most vulnerable. Any data on persons with disabilities?
So I don't have any data in my head, But I would be happy to talk with you more because I was looking at I have like a bunch of numbers in my head, but I'd be happy to talk with you more about that. And also definitely a great point for us to elevate that in our communications around this work.
Yeah, I imagine that also gets to Sandra's point around, sometimes those data points aren't actually collected all the time. Do you either of you know anything nationally in terms of people with disabilities and the evictions impact on them?
Yeah, I have not seen data specifically on that. I do know that in general, there are so many housing barriers for folks with disabilities. It's one of the largest categories of fair housing complaints that HUD receives every year. And so it wouldn't, yeah, so I fully expect that there would also be that disproportionate impact, but I think there isn't that regular collection of the information certainly at the court level about whether this particular tenant has a disability.
The other aspect that leads me to believe that, people with disabilities are, would certainly be, a group that would disproportionately be harmed by eviction is just that we do know that people with disabilities are more economically vulnerable in many contexts. Rates of unemployment are significantly higher. So when you're already kind of at the economic margins, it's not going to take much to kind of push you off that cliff, which could mean the difference between having a roof over your head or being plunged into homelessness.
We have another question in the audience here, and Melissa's going to hand you the microphone there. So, yeah, even closer. Right, yeah.
Okay, what I wanted to know is, are there agencies that are available to consumers to help them pay their rent? Because I know that there are times, like as a single parent, when my children have gotten ill, then I miss work. And so if someone is depending on a certain amount of money coming in and they have a sick child, I know my sister had a child that ended up getting cancer. And so she and her husband were out of work for a very long period of time. Fortunately, people did donate through a GoFundMe page, but for people who were in those types of situations, there's got to be agencies out there that are available to help them. Can you please talk about some of those?
Yeah, one in particular that comes to mind is they call it DHAP. I believe that stands for Delaware Housing Assistance Program. And they help folks, navigate, not only navigate evictions, but also connect them with resources. And I believe that program is actually able to fund people to kind of help them stay in their homes. But that's why right to representation is so important, because when you look at states that have implemented it, it is another mechanism to connect people to resources before their eviction and kind of help navigate that too. And also you can look into the Eviction Defense Project in Delaware. They have their own Instagram. And so they regularly update information about, housing assistance that's available. You can also reach out to your local social services agency. But I know DHAP has been really instrumental in helping a lot of people during the past couple of years navigate this housing crisis.
All right, and we have another.
DHAP, DEHAP, the Delaware Housing Assistance Program.
Thanks, Javon.
Hello, I moved here in Delaware to Delaware I moved to Delaware in 2001, early 2001. I'm a homeowner, large house. I'm single, live alone. And over a period of 21 years, I've rented out a total of 8 times. Each and every occasion to rent has been a negative, a net loss. And for instance, my last renter left me between $15,000 and $20,000 of damages and unpaid bills. And frankly, looking at the procedure and process, time, et cetera, all involved, I'm sure some of you attorneys know exactly what I'm talking about, has led me to removing it from the market. And I'm not considering doing that. So I would love to see just more than one side of, instead of just a presentation panel, have some people who also discuss and represent the homeowners who are also victims to the system. So yeah, I'm not some evil rich landlord kicking people out. I'm the one who's got to pay my mortgage, pay my bills. So that's another aspect that I have not yet heard here.
Right, and I think that's actually a good point, because I do think like a misconception about these reforms is that they would only benefit renters. But in fact, you know, there are some, I think, solid benefits in these things for landlords as well. Anyone want to talk about some of those things and how it might benefit landlords after our announcement?
Please proceed with your next.
So not even just from, you know, what we think, because we actually, even in our campaigning, we actually worked with landlords who supported right to representation in our work. But from states and jurisdictions that have enacted this, they've found it helpful to be able to have someone be able to explain not even just the eviction process, but the laws to the renter, rather than the landlord having to explain, you know, a really robust system to the renter. It also helped with mediation, you know, coming up with an agreement, so to speak, that would help both people, rather than not just having the tenant feel like they got the unfair end of the stick when it comes to the court. And then also, right to representation helps landlords, you know, be able to collect on rent most of the time. So this isn't, you know, not all of the time. So I'm not saying everything is perfect, but most of the time, and these states are indicating really positive outcomes for landlords and renters.
Mhm. Wonderful, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I'd like to talk with you more. And, you know, through the last year, our coalition has had many conversations with rental associations. Like, I've been on calls with over 20 people. We've talked to people who are renters. We talked to people who are landlords who have, you know, two you know, units, up to people who own like a large population of our housing inventory. So definitely open to that conversations, and it's necessary.
And we have another question in the back over here.
Hi. Two questions very quickly. How much consideration has been given to alternatives to dispute resolution in courts, namely arbitration, statutorily required arbitration? And number two, how much work has been done to mobilize houses of worship, churches, and synagogues in terms of this campaign that you're involved in here in Delaware?
Can you repeat the first question? Sorry.
About arbitration.
Yes. So, you know, people are so used to going to court, right? And so I'm thinking, has any thought been given to taking things outside of court and taking the situation, you know, and statutorily required arbitration?
Well, you know, I think that is what, you know, a pre-filing eviction diversion program would do. It would allow for the renter and the landlord or property owner to be able to discuss their situation before filing for eviction. And, you know, that's, you know, I think when I think of restorative justice, right, people think about restorative justice when it's related to criminal justice. And, you know, we've heard about it more in education, but it's definitely applicable to housing, such a fundamental right, and something that's necessary in order for a person to have, you know, positive well-being, mental health, physical health. Like, not having shelter impacts so much to where we need to think outside of the box and ensure that people have housing. And then when it comes to the churches, you must be connected and want to talk to us more about this. But like, our work has not stopped. As that's why we're here. So it's definitely a need for us to connect more, you know, not just with churches, but other organizations that are definitely necessary for the plight. And not just organizations, people, right? We need people really to come out in full force for this.
Well, and this gets to, this is my closing question, gets to, again, what's next? How are we going to build the base? So the last question that I have here from the audience on Zoom is, what has to happen to get similar bills through the House in the next General Assembly?
I would say that the main thing that has to happen is we need mobilization of people in the state demanding it. It's not gonna. This is not something that's going to be achieved through kind of quiet backroom discussions and negotiations. It's going to happen because the people of this state are demanding it, and I think that that's a really important piece for us to try, certainly as a organization, as a campaign, as a coalition in 2023, to do more to activate people so that lawmakers, regardless of where they stand on this issue, are hearing from people saying, we need right to representation in Delaware.
Any other closing thoughts? Javon's just giving a thumbs up. Sandra, anything else to add?
Yeah, I think Ian said it wonderfully.
That we need people power, right? We need to hear the voices of people who are impacted. When we have thousands of people who are evicted every year here in the state of Delaware, we need those folks to show up and lead the way. I think Ian said it so beautifully too earlier that we really want to value their leadership in this work as well. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and close this up. Again, I wanna thank all of you who came here tonight in person, but also all the folks out in Zoom. I wanna invite you to, again, take action in a couple different ways. Javon gave you a couple of different options. And I'm gonna say, number one, go to the ACLU of Delaware website, sign up for our email alerts, become a member. That's aclu-de.org. But also go to our Vote Delaware website. Again, it's not just enough to vote, it's also being an informed voter and voting your values when you go to the ballot box. And so again, on that votedelaware.org website, there's going to be a ton of information about multiple issues that I know all of you care about. And you are gonna see where your candidates for elected office this year stand on those issues. And again, as we heard our panelists so eloquently say, we need to have some accountability. We need to make sure that we have people in office who will advance the things that will bring true justice and equity here in this state. So again, such an important issue. I want to thank our panelists for talking about this and sharing their knowledge. Let's give them a round of applause and we'll close on up.